I'm a data scientist at Huddle, and this is my second year presenting, so I'm really thrilled to be back here. First off, I want to thank a few people. Ryan has put together an amazing conference. Like, all these talks have been really incredible so far, so I'm glad to be here presenting. Secondly, I realized that I probably came up with the most boring possible title. So I wanted to kind of correct that on the fly. So instead of football passing, what I would rather do is entitle this How to Not Win the Premier League, using imaginary footballs. So we'll kind of get into that later. So just to kind of give an overview of what I'll be talking about, I'm going to be talking about a pass probability model. So this model basically takes in tracking data and tries to compute the likelihood that pass will succeed or fail. I didn't realize this until a few weeks ago, but the thing I presented last year, this pitch control field, the two actually come from similar mathematical background, which I recently kind of found out when I was playing around with math. And at the end, and also at the beginning, I'm kind of going to delve into some player and team metrics that we can derive from this passing model that give us a way to kind of quantify passing skill, receiving skill, etc. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about passing from a general perspective. So great passing in football kind of has a very specific signature. So first off, we expect great passing to be very precise. In other words, when a player passes the ball, he needs to locate it very precisely, otherwise it will be intercepted or blocked or something. So here's an example. I believe this is Bakuna passing to Tom Cleverley. I think the match is Aston Villa versus Everton, and then Cleverley sends it in for a beautiful goal. So as you can see in this example here, it's a very precise pass, it's very long, it's a hard to execute pass, and it's a very valuable pass. So that passing precision is definitely one of those key components of a great pass. The next component is the receiving. So in addition to having a well-placed pass, you have to have a highly skillful receiver who's able to control that pass and then do something with it. So here we see an example of, I think it's Ronaldo, just putting a perfect touch on the ball to control it. So these are the two components kind of from the offensive side. Now, from the defensive perspective, we want to be able to intercept passes. So that requires a lot of the same skill set as receiving a pass. Because you have to control it, you have to be able to keep it away from the opposing players, you have to be precisely located, etc. So that kind of, that aspect of it we call the interception efficiency, basically. And then the last pass kind of component, which we already touched on, is the value. So this toy example up here, the pass goes into the attacker, who's then in a great scoring position. So that's a very valuable pass because it could result in a score. So just to kind of show you where we're heading, here's a positional performance radar chart. Because we're using tracking data, we're keeping this completely anonymous. So this is just aggregate player positions. Not going to discuss any team in particular. So what you can see here is that these different metrics that we end up computing, and we're going to go through the computation of that, give a bit of a DNA of different players and different player positions. So as you'd expect, the attacking midfielder and the second striker are highly skilled at receiving passes. And they have fairly high passing precision, and because they play that somewhat similar role, their kind of metrics here are the same. Other things that stand out is that it's the central defenders who have the highest passing value. So the way I interpret that is the central defenders are the ones who are putting passes forward that are very valuable. So if there's a turnover from those, it doesn't hurt their team a lot. But if it succeeds, it puts the team in a good position for a scoring chance. Passing precision, this is for me the most surprising one. Strikers have the highest passing precision. And I'm not sure if this is a bug or a feature of the model. If it's a feature, it could be because a lot of times strikers end up in scenarios where they're, say, in the attacking third, and they're surrounded by defenders, and in order for their team to retain possession, they have to pass backwards to another player. And that can be a very challenging pass, even though we don't necessarily think of it as a valuable pass. And just to kind of point out what this stuff is related to. So although the data is anonymous, I can mention, like I said in the new title of the slides, how to win or how to not win the Premier League with imaginary footballs. Interception efficiency and pass value have a strong correlation with league standing. There is one very prominent example using the data from last season about how not to win the league. So moving forward, there's some terminology here that I'd like to go through. So when I say intercept, when you think of interceptions, you're thinking of a pass that's received by a defender, not a player from the same team. Now, intercept I'm going to use in the more physical sense. So an intercept is when the trajectory of the player intercepts the trajectory of the ball. Control, I define this as basically the ability to make a controlled touch. So just because you can get to the ball doesn't mean you can control it. So to control it, you have to be able to execute a pass, you have to be able to dribble the ball, there has to be some sort of control element there. The receiver we define as the first player to control the ball after the pass. That can be a player from the same team as the passer or the opposing team. So in this kind of generic sense, the receiver doesn't matter if it's intercepted or completed, it's still the receiver. And then the other two terms are kind of as we typically define them. So the first component of the model is the time it takes players to intercept. And by intercept, we mean intersecting the trajectory. So in the case of a stationary ball, this is very simple. If you have the red player and the blue player, usually it's going to be the red player who gets to the ball first, because he's closer. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the other player will get to it. So we need to build in some fundamental uncertainties that are based on differences in player speeds, differences in player efforts, differences in player awareness even, like if you're not paying attention. Now, when we add in a moving ball, things get more challenging. Because although the red player can reach the ball first, if it's moving past him at a fairly high rate, if he misses it, he's not going to get it. So if he's a little bit too slow, if he's not paying attention, he's not going to get that pass. So just because he could get there first doesn't mean we want our model to say he receives the pass 100% of the time. The blue player could also get it. And because the ball slowed down later in the trajectory, there's more what we call intercept vectors available to the blue player. So the red player has to be very precise to receive the pass. The blue player, however, has a lot of different opportunities because the ball slowed down later in the trajectory. So we call each of these lines an intercept vector. And the way you can think of it is, if a ball is whizzing by you, you have to precisely put your foot out, you have to precisely run towards it in order to control it. Whereas if the ball is slowly rolling past you, there's a billion different ways that you could control that pass. So we would want, in this example, the blue player to have a higher probability of receiving this pass than the red player. And most models where you just give the pass to the first person who could get to it, it's going to be the red player every time, which is not physical. So what is an intercept vector? Like I said, it's a hypothetical way in which a player can reach the ball. And if there's more of them, receiving the pass should be easier. So mathematically, we can actually go through kind of a toy example here, where we assign a probability weight to each intercept vector. So what you can do is you can think of we're stepping through time in some discrete increment, say a tenth of a second. And at each tenth of a second, we assign some weight of probability to each player that they could receive that pass in that time frame. So suppose the ball is going past the red player, and he has a 10% probability of receiving the pass in that tenth of a second. Now, this 10% right now is pulled out of thin air, but later we're going to actually derive that using real data from the Premier League. Now, the ball goes a little bit further, and what we have to do here, I'll go back 2 slides. So in the real model, like I said, we derive this number. Now, how much probability remains if after that first tenth of a second, the player has a 10% chance of getting the pass? Well, 100 minus 10 is 90. So that's how much probability remains. So we have to multiply for the next intercept vector, 90 times 10, which gives us 9%. And again, for the third intercept vector for the red player. So that's a total kind of probability of controlling the pass for the red player of 27.1%. Now, like I said, the 10% is pulled out of thin air. We're going to derive it later. Now the ball keeps going, and what we're interested in now is how much likelihood does the blue player have to receive the pass. So we have to take the remaining probability, which is 72.9, multiplied by the weight of the intercept vector, get 7.3. Do this a few times, and we get a total 34.2% probability that the blue player controls the pass. So this is just a simple toy example. What we end up doing is taking these 2 core concepts, so time to intercept and time to control, we parameterize them. So time to intercept, we parameterize with a sigma, which is the temporal uncertainty on how long it takes me to get to the ball. So if normally it takes me 3 seconds to get to this point, and with a lower or higher effort, I could get there in 2 or in 5 if I'm slower, then that's kind of taken into account by that sigma. Then the control density is that how much weight do we assign per time segment to your ability to control. So the way you can think of that lambda, that control density, is how long do I have to be around the ball before I have a reasonable chance of controlling it. So for most people, that's going to be like some fraction of a second. Now here's the obligatory math slide, and I'm going to kind of rush through this because I don't really want to talk about it in too much detail. But suffice it to say that we basically take that toy model, write it out as a differential equation, and then solve it numerically. Now I mentioned already the time to intercept and the time to control. So as I said, with the time to intercept, if you're on the left-hand side of that sigmoid-esque looking thing, that implies you have higher effort or a faster player. If you're on the right-hand side, it's lower effort or a slower player. With the time to control, this is going to vary by player, but basically you can think of this parameter as 1 over the time it takes you to control the ball. So if your lambda, that control density, is 4.3, I think the actual fitted value you get is 4.6, then it should take, most players will be able to control the pass in less than a second, by about 0.5 seconds. Okay, so here's an actual example using real numbers. And the thing I'd like to point out is that this is a hypothetical pass. So this model, although it's based on real data, can give probabilities for hypothetical scenarios. This is useful because we could say, look at other passes a player might have been able to make and say, were those better, higher probability passes? So in this example, each dash represents a temporal chunk, so the ball moving in a specific time chunk. And each line towards that ball's trajectory indicates the weight or the probability that that player will receive that pass in that time segment. So player 0 has the first go at it, but because he would have to be really precise to get to it, he only gets a 17.8% likelihood of receiving the pass. Player 1, much higher because he has a lot more options open to him, so he gets a 56. And then player 2, because even though he has a ton of options open to him, it's likely that player 0 or player 1's already got it. So he's got the remaining probability, 26.2. Okay, so this is the PDF and CDF of that previous example. So this shows how the likelihood of controlling the pass evolves with the distance the pass has gone. So you can see, over the first 20 meters, it's that first guy only has a chance of receiving the pass. So it goes up to about 17. And then on the plot on the right, you can see, it goes upwards as player 1 and player 2 have a chance until it peaks at 1 towards the end of the pass. Okay, now here's the fitting slide. So like I said, this is data-driven, even though with the toy example, I pulled the numbers out of thin air. With this example, we're actually fitting it. So we basically take real TRACAB data, real Opta data, we look for passes, we look for the result, and we see which parameters best maximize the likelihood. And we end up getting a time to intercept uncertainty of about 0.5 seconds, and a time to control density, which corresponds to about 0.7 seconds to control a pass with a 95% likelihood. So what sort of questions could an analyst answer with this model? One question we might be curious about is to look for times when one of our players makes a risky pass. So suppose we want to find a pass with less than a 40% pass probability, so that we can go in and see, was it a good decision, was it a bad decision, maybe you should make less low probability passes. So here's an actual example. The numbers are all randomized, so you can't figure out which teams these were. This has a pass probability of 24%. The blue player is passing. I believe he's trying to pass to player 6, but it gets intercepted by the red player, and it results in a failed pass. So we could, automatically find these just from data, and look into them. Another example we might want to answer is, like, when was there a high probability pass to a striker or winger on the opposing team? So this could be interesting because if there is a high probability, pass that's longer than 15 or 20 meters to a striker or a winger, that probably indicates that somebody wasn't doing their job or wasn't covering that person. So here's an example where player 5 passes to, I believe that's a winger there. The pass has a 68% probability of succeeding, and sure enough, it succeeds. So in that case, it looks like somebody was kind of left somewhat open. So in the beginning, we talked about performance and how we can measure it for players, for teams, for positions. We showed the positional plot. So I want to go through how we can use this pass probability model to measure player-team performance. So the first one that I want to look at is the value of the pass. So here's two hypothetical scenarios. On the left, we see a player who could pass into the box. And this attacking player has a solid chance to score if he was able to receive that pass. Now, he's covered by 2 defenders, so it might be a low probability pass, but if it succeeds, it's very high value. Typically, we'd say this is a high value pass, even if it fails, because that's the correct thing to do. Pass to him, see if he scores, even if it fails. So we want to rate that highly, regardless of the outcome. In the situation on the right, we have a defender passing to another defender. The defender's covered, it's in their own defensive half, so he's not getting any value by that pass, because that other defender, he's in no position to do anything with the ball. And there's a chance of a turnover in your own half. So that's not a very valuable pass. We want to rate that negatively, or low value pass. So the way we do this is pretty much similar to gambling. We take the value of the pass if successful, times the probability of success, and subtract the penalty for failure times the probability for failure. And that gives a simple equation for the value of the pass. So I'm not going to go into how I quantify value, but suffice it to say I use a very simple model. I think it's similar to what Neil showed, where you're looking at the position and the likelihood of scoring from that position. But instead of looking at shot probabilities, I'm looking at every possession that occurred at that position, whether or not it resulted in a score. So in effect, what you get is 1 or 2%, or very, very small percent on the left-hand side of the pitch. And then on the attacking side, it goes up to like 95% right in front of the goal. And so this allows us to quantify that value. The next metric we want to look at is passing precision. So because I said this model can quantify the probabilities of hypothetical passes, we can actually compare a real pass that occurs to hypothetical passes. And effectively what we do is we grade the pass. So we take the pass, we vary it a little bit, change the angle and the speed of it, and then we say, how did it do compared to the other possible passes that were available in that direction? And that gives us literally in the same way as a scoring curve, like you remember high school, if everybody gets a 40% on a test, and you got a 45, well, you're going to still get that passing mark possibly. Similarly, we look to see where the actual pass probability is in comparison to the hypothetical, look at the percentile, and that gives us the passing precision. So for easy to complete passes, we would expect all of those hypothetical passes to have high pass probabilities. For hard to complete, they may skew off to the left, be harder to complete. So if you have a high precision pass, you'll be kind of given a higher score for that. Think of it as grading on a curve. The last 2 metrics are about efficiency. And I'm going to switch topics and talk about coins for a second. So we've all seen these coins. And what we want to do with this coin is flip it. So we're going to flip it because we want to see what happens when we flip it. So we start flipping. We flip it once, flip it twice. Comes up heads both times. Do you think it's fair? There's not enough statistics. Good answer. Good answer. So we'll flip it again, and sure enough, the tails comes up. So, okay, it's probably fair, right? Well, we kept flipping, and we keep flipping. So now it's come up heads 4 times out of 5, but it's only 5 tries. So we really don't know. It's starting to look like it might not be fair, but we don't know. So we keep flipping, flipping, and we end up getting that 8 out of 10 times it was heads. So it's likely that this coin might not be fair, especially if this pattern continues with maybe 100 coin flips. So what we're doing with passing and receiving efficiency is we're basically treating players like a coin. We say an average coin should be heads or tails 50-50. An average player should receive a 50-50 pass 50% of the time. Because we know the exact probabilities from the passing model, we just say, did that player receive more passes than the sum of the probabilities of the passes? And then we divide those numbers. So if the 25%, so suppose there's a coin here on the left, and it comes up heads 25% of the time. It's a below average coin, terrible coin. Have another coin that comes up heads 50%, average coin, and another that comes up 75%, that's an above average coin. So we just divide those numbers, and that gives us an efficiency. The higher the efficiency, the better the coin, or the better the player. So we can do this with receiving efficiencies. So we look at 3 examples here. The top example is a very high likelihood pass, so it's likely that that receiver should be able to receive it with a 95% pass probability. The second one, it's a little bit less likely. There's a defender who's kind of in the way there, so that's a 70% pass probability. And the last one, it's poorly kicked pass, going straight to a defender, so he's only got a 20% probability of receiving that pass. We sum those up, 0.95, 0.7, 0.2, get 1.8. So that's the expected number of receptions that that player should have. And then we can compare that to the actual number of passes he received. So if he doesn't receive any of those, this is a terrible player. If he receives 1, it's below average but low statistics. If he receives 2, that's pretty average. And if he receives 3, that's very good, because it means he pulled a rabbit out of his hat on that last one that should have been intercepted. Now, similarly, we can do that for a defensive metric. So it's the exact same thing, except now we just do 1 minus the pass probability and give that to the defender. Now, you might say, well, how does this work when there's more players on the pitch? Well, because the model assigns a pass probability, a pass reception probability to every single player, regardless of team, we can do this for every single player, even though there's 22 on the pitch. So that gives us those performance metrics. I'll show this slide again, kind of, now that we've discussed them. This is the results. So this shows how these metrics play out for different positions. And then I will open it up for questions.